Hornchurch in Essex in England rapidly expanded in the interwar years. One of the main developments was Elm Park, a private housing estate for aspiring couples and families who wanted to own their own home. Pamela Doreen Coventry had been born on 12 February 1929, but her mother died, and her father, Stanley Samuel Coventry, an electrician, remarried in 1935. By 1938, Stanley, his second wife Edith, and Pamela had moved to Morecambe Close on the new estate, although at that point Stanley was working in Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire. He'd returned home for the holidays before heading back to his work on the Tuesday after Christmas that year. Pamela was a popular girl. She was musical and attended lessons every Tuesday in nearby Dibben Avenue and attended Benhurst Primary School. The school was close enough to her house that she always made her way home for lunch. On Tuesday, 3rd January 1939, Pamela returned home from her music lesson at around 6:30. She asked Edith if she could run an errand for a man on Coronation Drive, but her stepmother wasn't too sure, so asked if she knew him. She said she did, and that she'd met him on her way home from her lesson. Edith said no. Nothing more was thought about the incident. Then, on Wednesday 18th January, the Coventry's world was turned upside down. That morning, Pamela had attended school as usual, returning home for lunch around 12:45, and left the house around half an hour later. Although the weather was reasonably mild for the time of year, Pamela wore warm undergarments, a pink woolen jumper, her gym slip, a swagger pattern blue coat with 2 metal buttons at the neck, light fawn woolen stockings, a pale green beret, green gloves, and brown Wellington boots, size 3. She also carried with her a brown paper bag containing slippers. Edith waved her stepdaughter off and watched her until she passed the corner of Coronation Drive. She'd arranged to meet up with 10-year-old Patricia Winger, one of her school friends, but she never appeared. At the end of the school day, Edith went to meet Pamela at 4 o'clock, but she was nowhere to be seen. She asked the school where she was and was told that she'd been marked absent that afternoon by her teacher. She asked Pamela's friends if they'd seen her, but none had. She reported Pamela missing at the local police station shortly afterwards. Edith returned home and waited for news. At around 10:30 that evening, the rain began lashing down, but Pamela still hadn't returned home. The following day, the girl's description was widely circulated. That morning, night watchman Charles Judge Horseman was cycling down Wood Lane, not far from Coronation Drive or Morecambe Close, when he discovered the naked body of a young girl lying on an old mattress. She'd been trussed up with 15 feet of electrical or telephone cable, with the only piece of clothing on her, her white petticoat, tied round her neck. Horseman immediately ran to the nearby home of Wing Commander Walkington of the nearby RAF base and called the police. Dr. S.E. Camps, the Essex County pathologist, was also called, and he certified that she'd been dead for a few hours. She'd also been assaulted. Immediately, Scotland Yard were called in, and along with Essex Police and the RAF, the area was scoured for clues, especially her missing clothing, with the investigation being headed up by Superintendent Knights and Detective Inspector Baker. Chief Inspector Bridger from Scotland Yard assisted the local police. Pamela was soon identified. The post-mortem was carried out by Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Pamela had been hit on the lower right jaw, where there was a large bruise, probably the result of a punch. A bruise was visible behind her left ear that may have been caused by falling against a hard surface, most likely rendering her unconscious before the assault took place. However, these injuries didn't kill her. Death was asphyxia due to strangulation by the hands, according to Spilsbury. The body was clean and dry, meaning it had been deposited at the site where she was found after the rain had stopped. During the post-mortem, when she was stretched out, a hand-rolled cigarette end was discovered, dropped by the killer. It was also ascertained she'd put up a fight and had probably scratched her killer. The metal white bangle on her right arm had also been flattened. The cable was a vital clue in the case. It was a piece of 7-strand copper wire, insulated with shiny black material. A few pieces of tarred string were tied to it at intervals, and it was surmised that it had been used to tie up a runner bean frame in a garden or allotment. There was also a piece of green cable found nearby. But neither yielded any clues about the killer. 2 days after Pamela was found, her Wellington boots were discovered in a ditch in Apscross Lane. They had been placed in a paper bag bearing the word Leonard's, the same one Pamela had been carrying, with her slippers in it. Police believed the murder had been committed outdoors and that a local man had to be the perpetrator, but also believed the boots had been specifically placed where they were found. The man Pamela had mentioned to her stepmother and friends now came under the spotlight. Who was he? The police did house-to-house inquiries along Coronation Drive, asking people about their movements between 1 and 2 p.m. on 18th January, and one of the people they spoke to was milkman Walter Glynn. He told police about Leonard Richardson, a 28-year-old married man whose wife, Ivy, was in hospital giving birth to their second child. Richardson worked shifts at the May and Baker chemical factory in Dagenham and would cycle to his work, a journey of around 15 minutes. On the week of 16th January, he was working the late shift, 2 p.m. to 11 p.m, and Glynn recalled seeing him around 1:15 on the 18th of January, leaving a cafe and cycling down Southend Road, away from Coronation Drive, where he lived. He had nodded to Glynn as he passed. At the top of Wood Lane, Glynn noticed that he stopped, turned round and cycled back to Coronation Drive. He didn't see him again that day. Richardson was questioned by the police on 26th January, the same day Pamela was buried at Barking Cemetery. During the interrogation, he rolled a cigarette. A few minutes later, the papers, tobacco pouch and tobacco were taken from him, and following analysis were found to be the same type of papers and tobacco as that found on Pamela's body. He cooperated throughout, but Inspector Bridger noticed an abrasion on the knuckle of the small fingers of both hands. The one on the left hand was recent. He told investigators that he would have to set off for work at 1:25, to get to his work for 2 p.m. On Monday 16th January, he'd had an accident at work. Couldn't remember how he got to work on the Tuesday, but on the Wednesday he'd caught the train, a 3-minute journey. Asked if he'd approached a little girl to run an errand for him, he said yes. That was during the first week his wife was in hospital, and he asked her to get some tobacco for him. However, the little girl had run away. A neighbour's daughter ran the errand instead. This had happened the week after Pamela had spoken to her stepmother. Richardson's story checked out. The neighbour corroborated that the little girl had run away. His work confirmed his accident on Monday the 16th and that he'd clocked in at 1:55 on the Wednesday. Dr. George Steen confirmed he'd seen him, although he saw no signs of a chemical accident, but did say he seemed to be suffering from shock and nervousness. He also treated him for mild conjunctivitis. One of Richardson's neighbours saw him on 18th January running towards the train station and noticed he was wearing his cycle clips, but he stopped to remove them. She remembered the incident as she thought there was something wrong with his new baby. On 28th January, a parcel wrapped in newspaper dated 11th January was spotted by a schoolboy going over the Elm Park railway bridge, which turned out to be more of the cable that had bound Pamela, along with 2 metal buttons and a yellow badge, both of which had been on Pamela's clothing. Police were convinced Richardson was guilty. His house backed on to the half-built houses on the estate and was only a short distance from where she was found. They had also received a visit from Richardson's neighbour, Mr. Curley, who handed in a length of green cable which had attached to it a piece of creosoted string. Curley said Richardson had given him it the previous December. He also said he'd seen him on the 18th of January and he seemed to be worried. When asked, he told him he had private worries. On 1st February, Richardson was arrested at his work and charged with the murder of Pamela. A search of his shed was made and green cable with creosoted string was found. Adhesive tape, similar to that bound the newspaper package, was also discovered. This was all handed over to Home Office analyst Dr. G. Roach Lynch. Leonard Richardson's trial got underway at the Old Bailey in London on 27th March before Sir Anthony Hawke, Mr. Justice Hawke. He was defended by Mr. Roger Wynne and pleaded not guilty. A new witness took the stand, Mrs. Violet Cavalier, who stated Richardson had been on the same train as her on the Tuesday. He had told her he'd started out on his bike, but with the weather being foul, had turned back and decided to take the train. Ivy Richardson also told the court that the stubs found on him had been collected over the previous few weeks by her and her brother-in-law, handed over by neighbours and some found on factory floors, and these had been passed to their solicitor. Frank Hall, the general manager of the Rizla Cigarette Paper Company, had received them and noted that many had been rolled with an underturn, like Richardson's, so this wasn't as unusual as the prosecution wanted the court to believe. 3 days later, the jury found Richardson not guilty of the murder of Pamela, and after a short break, he returned to his work. The Beast of Hornchurch, as the killer was dubbed, was never found, and 9-year-old Pamela Coventry's murder remains unsolved to this day.